Hello. I hope everyone is making it back to their respective computers or phones or whatever, so they can be present for the next presentation, which I trust will be very nice. We will be having Damon Tringham, who is a university teacher at the Department of English at the University of Turku in Finland. He is currently working on his PhD thesis on the translation of Terry Pratchett's Discworld novel into Finnish, focusing specifically on the translation of allusions, cultural references, and humor. Today, he will speak about allusions and cultural references in translation. So, floor is to you, Damon. Please go ahead.
Okay, right. Well, hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, although in slightly reduced circumstances. It would, of course, have been wonderful to have been present with you all. My focus is going to be then on cultural references and allusions today. So if we move on fairly briskly, my presentation structure then looks like this. Well, I'll go through the purpose of my study, this particular part of my research, a quick definition of cultural references, talk about my data gathering method, look very quickly at the references that I've selected, and then we'll look at the results, which effectively are comparisons between British and New Zealander responses and American readers' responses on the one hand, and then between Finnish readers of Pratchett in English and the native speakers on the other hand. And also, to introduce a third hand, I shall talk about the differences between Finns reading in Finnish versus Finns reading in the English original. And I'll talk a little bit about translation strategies at that point. So then, what I'm doing with this piece of my research is I'm trying to look at how well native speakers identify cultural references when they are reading Pratchett, because I'm also particularly interested in how Finnish translations work in carrying across these references. But of course, for me to know how well the Finns are doing, if, for instance, they only pick up a certain amount of them, I want to know how well native speakers do. So I've got some kind of equivalent that I can look for. So that was one of my main reasons. The second one, I want to look at how well translation strategies are working in order to allow Pratchett's style of writing to work in a second language, in a second cultural context. It's interesting, actually, that when we talk about America as opposed to the British and pretty much the New Zealander system as well, that America represents sort of another cultural context to a large degree, although we share a Western society and an Anglo-American society, that there are strong differences between the norms and the cultural reference. So these are the issues that I'm hoping to deal with today. Well, within translation studies, we have many different terms and forms which people have used to talk about cultural items, if you like. And here are a few of the well-known ones. There are more. Cultural word, culture-specific item, culturine, and culture-specific references from Gambier. So it's not an area which, for instance, has like one term that everybody uses and accepts. It's a living part of our discipline. If we look then at what I'm going to be talking about, I like to think of cultural references, perhaps a working definition that I might use would be a cultural reference refers to a text external referent which belongs to assumed shared knowledge, assumed here by the author. So the cultural reference is placed there by the author for a purpose. Now, the degree to which we can, or he or she, can assume knowledge depends also upon the reference itself and the referent itself. So some of them are more sort of available to the would-be reader in terms of recency, in terms of fame, or in terms of universality. Okay, so some of these might just be to do with changes of culture. These might change how famous something is or how universal something is. But also, even within cultures, there may be differences. And also, as we know with Pratchett, sometimes some of the references are very accessible, and some of them are so well hidden we might almost call them sort of Easter eggs, if you like. Well, here's my data gathering method. I asked about 8 references from Jingo, And they were examined via a voluntary international questionnaire for respondents from the US, the UK, and New Zealand, and a compulsory internal questionnaire for Finnish students of English. And 6 of these references have been chosen for discussion here. Now, the voluntary international questionnaire, I owe a debt of gratitude to several academics in several countries who were prepared to distribute the URL for my questionnaire. I'm very grateful to them. And the compulsory one, I basically forced my students in some of my courses to do the questionnaire as part of their coursework. Excuse me. So then if we move on to the respondents themselves, I had about 170 respondents I'm working with here. I've got around 81 from the United States, around 20 UK and New Zealand respondents, and 69 Finnish respondents. They're all broadly comparable, all at university level, college level, all involved in something to do with English, English literature, or linguistics. Although some of the US respondents might be slightly younger, but they're all earning college credit. So broadly comparable. We'll talk about the 2 groups of Finnish respondents a little later. Here we go on to the references themselves. These are as they stand in the Pratchett text. So there's a reference to or reference is a lone bowman. And this note will self-destruct in 5 seconds. The keystones of the watch, Jelly Baby, Sweeney Jones, and Doctor of Sweet Fanny Adams. And I chose these. It's 3 which are sourced, if you like, from American culture particularly, the first 3, and the second set of 3 are very British orientated. Now, this is, of course, their initial situation. Naturally, some of them have spread universally, some have not. All of these were embedded in a paragraph of text when the respondents encountered them in order to contextualize them. So they weren't just given like this or just one sentence. They were given text from the work to enable them to sort of read it in its natural position. And it was underlined. And then I asked them to explain what they understood by it. Okay, let's move on to the next one. These are then the referents with a TS. These are the elements which are being referred to. So the lone gunman from the Kennedy assassination, the Warren report, the Mission Impossible reference, and perhaps more broadly to the spy genre in general. The Keystone Cops, they were the keystones of the watch. This is particularly evident if you're British, because, or native English speaker. Perhaps it's easier to read from the context how dry Vimes is being at that point, and how he's picked out 2 of his most incompetent policemen, and he calls them, yes, they're the keystones of the watch. And so they fit very well with this Keystone Cops issue. Jelly Baby refers to jelly babies, British sweets. So for people who consume American candy, it might not come to mind or come to ear so easily, or not even know the concept. Sweeney Jones is a reference to Sweeney Todd. Now, of course, if you encountered that just as it stands, it wouldn't be so clear. But in the text, you can see that it's also a barber and also someone who's been accused of killing people. And then there's Sweet Fanny Adams. Now, the ultimate referent of this is a young English girl who was murdered quite horribly in the 19th century. But many other people will recognize it as being slang for nothing at all, Sweet FA, standing for, I think we can all guess. And it was interesting because both of these things, the ultimate referent and even the Sweet FA one, were very, very rarely referred to. But we'll talk about this one in greater detail a little later on. In fact, the Sweet Fanny Adams method, element appears in a longer context. It's Doctor of Sweet Fanny Adams, of course in English therefore meaning a doctor of nothing, basically. And it's embedded originally in Latin in the text, not in my part, which I gave the respondents to look at. But first, one of the encounters with it is in Pseudo-Latin, both in the English version and in the translation. And then one of the characters in the story translates it into ordinary English in the English version and into Finnish, the Finnish version. We'll come to this a little later on. We'll now transition on to the data then. Much of the data is quantitative, but it is not robust enough for me to make statistical definite claims. I find it to be sort of more indicative, broadly of interest. There are definite patterns. And qualitative analysis is also very important here. It's something I'm looking at a lot. In the questionnaire, I asked people, as part of the questionnaire, whether, or how many books they read a year which were fictional. How many fictional works, roughly, do you read a year? I also asked if they had read Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, any of, and to give me a rough sort of number. It's interesting that these correlated very well. An overwhelming majority of people who read Terry Pratchett read an average number of books, according to the numbers given. I'm not saying there's an average number for people, but within the blocks given, an average number, or the higher end of it. Whereas about 18 or so of those who didn't read at all scored 0, and of course they read no Terry Pratchett books, and read none, or read one, sorry, and of course read no Terry Pratchett books. So I've used Terry Pratchett as focused on this, particularly also because I am very focused upon how relevant this is for translators. If you are going to translate a Terry Pratchett novel, and you are faced with a cultural reference of some kind, or something which you feel might be a cultural reference, how much time and effort should the translator invest in this in order to generate the best possible outcome? And I think that we will see that there is a good argument for claiming that we need a lot of effort here. Will they be identified if you translate them well? Because that's the payoff, isn't it, for the reader, when you see the thing and you spot it, particularly the ones which are more heavily hidden. What I'm interested in here is the fact that reading Pratchett triples your chance of identifying successfully. Several people used replied that they thought they identified what the reference was, but many were misled in various directions. But although the numbers are small, what I find is interesting is it triples it. And we will find this in every set of data. This also works despite the fact that when I asked in the same questionnaire whether people were using any websites which collect and explain Pratchett's references, I think I got, like, from each set of data, it was like 1, maybe. And even those people said things like, I used it once. So it seems unlikely that this data is polluted by the fact that people have been browsing sites and spotting them by using websites which collect this information. If we look here, we can see that ones who've read Pratchett get almost everything. They're very successful at all. The only one which is vague from the British and New Zealanders is the Keystones of the Watch. Okay, that one didn't cop up so well. Those who hadn't read Pratchett didn't get it at all. But otherwise, the percentages here seem reasonably high for those who've read Pratchett. I'd like to contrast this now then with the American data, where despite having 81 people responding, only 6 had read Pratchett. It's a very small number, but you'll notice that the percentage, again, of spotting things, it's triple, well, more than the percentage of those who have not read Pratchett. Once again, the ones which are most common, however, the ones easiest to spot seem to be films. It's a visual medium. The 2 films which are spotted most readily, which are the Demon Barber of Fleet Street and Mission Impossible series, they are recent and they are largely sort of global. Certainly the version of the Mission Impossible series. So again, here we see that there's this tripling effect. Films are the most prolific source, if you like, for people. They're the ones where people are picking up on the information. What I found interesting was the Americans were also weak on American-sourced cultural reference. The Lone Bowman thing, many people mentioned, oh yeah, Lone Gunman. But as many of you who've read Jingo know, a large percentage of the novel, at the beginning particularly, sort of puts you in a position where it's the Kennedy sort of cavalcade going along, and an assassination attempt occurs, and there are multiple references which are Kennedy related. And yet, the Americans reading it didn't make this connection. They talked about the sort of lone gunmen of people today, terrorist acts and so on, but very few actually made the sort of the ultimate jump, if you like, to the source. Unlike the British and New Zealanders. So I found that quite interesting. Also, the Keystone Cops appear to have faded out of cultural knowledge for many Americans, at least for these 81. So to summarize this part then, reading Pratchett seems to triple your chance of successfully understanding a reference. at least according to the data available to me. And I found it's interesting that it occurred in each of my three sort of groups. You know, the New Zealanders and the UK people, I put them together. So the two groups, this is true of both. Also, that film references resonate best. The low figures for the US set may have multiple causes. Some of the respondents are a little younger by a year or two than some of the others from the other groups. Or maybe a cultural difference, a predilection for the visual. I can't really speculate on this here. If we move on to the Finnish then, here you'll notice I put in green, I'm talking about the Finns now reading in English, okay? So they are also reading the source at this point, okay? I had 35 of my students do this, 4 of whom said they had read Pratchett's Discworld novels specifically, 31 said they had not, which certainly shows that time has moved on. I think in my childhood, if you've asked late teens and early 20s people if they had read Pratchett, if they were at university, I think the percentage would have been an awful lot higher than this. But again, you can see that those reading in English, they missed a lot of things. The percentages are much more similar to the American percentages, actually, both for the Pratchetts and not read Pratchett's ones. But weirdly, one of them picked up on the Sweet Fanny Adams original meaning. I was startled about that. And none picked up on it in the those who had not read Pratchett. None of them picked up on it, so that was not too much of a surprise. But we will see a comparison coming up in one moment between this 0 and the figure in the next set of data. So if we move on to the next set, okay, if we look here now, comparing it to the Finnish, what I want to draw your attention to is this. For the first time, we had a drop in the percentage of people reading Pratchett, but I would like to point out the numbers are very small. And an increase of one person reading it and a decrease of one identification makes a big difference. This is why statistical analysis based here on sheer numbers isn't very powerful. But what I find interesting is the tripling effects. But what I'm interested in here is if you look at the bottom right for the Sweet Fanny Adams one, 10 get it. And there's a reason for this. Okay, the reason that 10 get this is because there's a different translation strategy. So what we'll do now is move on to talk about possible translation strategies, and I will explain why that was so successful. I'll very quickly talk you through it. There are many different strategies that are enumerated by translation scholars. Many different names for similar strategies or different strategies. Some names are used to describe different things. It's a very living area of research. These are terms used, which I am using for my own purposes here to be transparent. So I talk about transposition. This was also mentioned in our previous lecture, actually, where something is lifted from the source text and placed into the target text. So from the original to the translation. And nothing is changed. Might be transliterated, but the word is identical. The concept is identical, the term. Now, sometimes doing that means that the source culture reference is now lost because it doesn't make sense in the new situation and people don't recognize it. If it's a more universal issue, then it might well survive that sort of translocation and succeed in its new home. A direct translation is used normally to mean a near-literal translation. By literal, in most cases, we don't mean a sort of a word-for-word transcription, which creates either nonsense or a very poorly written language. It means one that meets the norms and the standards of an ordinary sentence in that language. But it's a direct translation, as close as one can get, and still good language. Sometimes, again, this is transparent enough, and the referent is so well known that this also works fine in the new target language and culture. On other occasions, it does not survive the process. And finally, replacement, which is one that we're very interested in here. What you can do is you can replace what you've got. Sometimes you can replace it with a target culture reference. So, for instance, we heard in a previous talk a reference where the Altogether Andrews, the name was translated using something which was familiar to the new audience. So the old reference is gone, the new reference appears, and it works beautifully. An alternative is to replace it with something else, which is maybe not a reference, but something either which keeps the text flowing, or something which introduces some other element, or is humorous or something, but the actual source culture element is lost. Well, let's see how these might be used then in practice. We'll have a little look here. On the left, the English forms, on the right, the Finnish. Shouldn't say much to you so far, so what I'll do is I'll mark them. We've got 3 direct translations where essentially it's exactly the same on the right as it is on the left. There's one change, and that's keystones of the watch becomes cornerstones of the watch in Finnish, which keeps the text flowing. It's a more natural phrase, but it makes it very difficult now to spot keystone cops, even if you're sort of translating a little bit in your head or familiar with the English-speaking world's culture. So that keeps it flowing, but doesn't transfer the source culture reference. Transposition then, Jelly Baby comes across and Sweeney Jones come across. Now, Jelly Baby was unrecognizable to a very large percentage of people, particularly the Americans, whereas Sweeney Jones was very successful everywhere, even with Finns. So here, when it went across to the Finns, Jelly Baby doesn't really say anything to Finns. Sweeney Jones did. Now, the reason here might be because Jelly Baby has existed in previous stories, so you can't really translate it now as something else. It's appeared as Jelly Baby in other works. It's a geographical location, and it's too late to introduce a change now if you're a translator. So it exists as a place. Whereas the Sweeney Jones joke, it's pretty much a one-off, and so although it didn't need translating in this case, it was successful as it was anyway, so it was just left. But now we come to Sweet Fanny Adams. How on earth did those 10 Finns get a Sweet Fanny Adams joke or reference? Well, what happened was it was replaced not with a target culture reference, but with target culture humor. What the person did is they created a doctorate of tyhjästä nyhjäämiseen, which means a doctorate in pulling something out of nothing, in a way, or magicking something out of nothing, or making a big deal out of when you've given no ingredients. So it was quite amusing, and it also appears in the translated text in a pseudo-Latin form at first, and then it's translated into Finnish for the Finnish reader to read it. It works very well. Many of my Finnish friends say it's quite cleverly done. It's quite amusing. So what you've done here is you've lost the cultural reference, but you've replaced it with humour, which is very successful. Perhaps we can have a quick look then at these sort of points of interest overall. What did we get from this? Well, as I say, transposition works for Sweeney Jones, but not for Jelly Baby. And its importance of location means it should be kept. If this was the first time it had appeared, for instance, you could make a good joke out of this. For instance, many of you might know the existence of the Spanish Sahara in the older days, and it was called, part of it was called Rio de Oro. If you wanted to make a joke out of it, you could have Rio de Oreo or something like this, and you would have an amusing reference to a place, and at the same time you'd have Oreo biscuits involved, and that would work for Americans, and also these days for the British and Finns. Now we also tend to have them in the shops. So yeah, Rio de Oreo would be an amusing change, but it also includes Rio, so it's a river, and it's a confectionery item, so it's similar to a sweet of some kind. So that would have been an option, but not really now. Too late in the series, can't be changed. And also, one problem that fantasy authors' translations sometimes have is you don't know what the fantasy author might do in the next book. Something might become dependent upon the name. This happened to the Finnish translator for one of the Harry Potter books, where a name was translated, but then a later book made an anagram or something out of the name. And of course, it didn't work properly now because the Finnish name had been translated. So this can cause problems sometimes. And so here we have then that it was very successful for the Finns to translate the Sweet Fanny Adams into this humorous sort of structure. It brought the humour into the work, which is what Pratchett is famous for, and it avoided a difficult reference which you could expect no Finn to get. Two main conclusions then. There does seem to be evidence that Pratchett's cultural references are less easy to identify for American readers, whether they've read Discworld novels or not. We know that some of the some of the Harry Potter novels, I believe they were domesticated for the American audience, to make them more understandable. The target audience was seen as one that would prefer to have American norms and find the text easier to follow, rather than a more foreignizing, challenging translation, which had lots of terms and phrases and words and slang which weren't necessarily clear to them. Maybe that could be true of Pratchett as well. I'm not advocating it, but it's an interesting point that you can see why some publishers might think that way about certain works. Adopting appropriate translation strategies can really improve a new reader's experience, we saw here, but also any reader's experience, really. If you feel that the translation, you're going to do a successful translation from your point of view as the translator, but you realize that it's just not going to serve its purpose for the readers, well, then all you're doing is being technically successful. You're not helping either the original author or the work, let alone the new reader. So you need to consider your translation strategies, and whether it's one which just makes it smoother and easier to read, like the change from keystone to cornerstone in Finnish with kulmakivi. We don't get the keystone cops even in the background anymore, they're gone, but it does avoid a translation which might have unusually sort of stressed keystone, which might not have made any sense to the Finns. Why would you have specifically said keystone when you should ordinarily say cornerstone? So you've made it easier for the reader. You might want to do it because you want to keep a reference simply because it's in the original and it's equally accessible to your new audience. So films seem to be very good in that regard from our data here. A reasonably modern film, which is fairly universally accessible, you'll probably be picked up if you make references to this. So these can stay. And then you've got creating humor as a compensation. If you really are stuck with something, this is too esoteric, even for Terry Pratchett, you know, no one's going to get it in this culture. So we need to change it. Well, then, with care, you can do justice to Pratchett and keep the humour and help the reader without stripping out the things which make Pratchett's work Pratchett. All of these things need to be used judiciously. Nothing should be applied as a rule. It's part of the translator's job to assess when and where to apply these different strategies. I'd like to say then, thank you very much. And any comments or questions? I have references here, should anybody want them.
We are working here as well at Trinity, very much involved with the study of culture-specific items, and it is always a bit of a difficult matter to see what can we define as one, and it's a very nice way you approach this, to just ask people what they do know about. In this regard, there are some interesting questions from the attendees. For example, one of them says, what about age? You can say, okay, we split up by country, but what about the age of the respondents? How old are they, and would that make a difference?
Okay, that's a very good point. I also asked about age, and I was forced to make decisions about this talk, about what I can talk about. The questionnaire, the international questionnaire, was heavy. It took a while for people to go through it, and I asked a lot of questions because, as you know, it was an anonymous questionnaire, which means if I realize that I'm missing some important data, something I really wanted to know, I cannot go back. So I actually got a lot of information from it, and age is one of those elements. And I have not yet analyzed it, but I am expecting age to play a significant role. After all, our general knowledge and cultural awareness only increases as we get older. And I'm inclined to think that actually for Finns reading in English, it might be the case that age is a better determinant of whether or not you can spot a cultural reference than actual sort of linguistic ability. That's my expectation. So I totally agree with that line of thinking, but it wasn't possible to pack everything in.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's also been a comment, which I think is highly relevant for what you're doing, that says that the UK editions differ from the US ones. Is this something you're aware of?
The US, sorry, what was different?
So the US versions of Pratchett's works would be different.
Yeah. It's I remember, because I remember reading about Pratchett, Terry Pratchett commenting on this himself. So yeah, the question could be, I could do it again in the sense that I could try to ask the data, which was domesticated for the American audience. But that's something, again, that I want. What I was really seeking to do now was to make sure, as tightly as possible, that I had similar groups of people and similar data. And I had to make decisions about what I was prepared to have change between the groups, because I'm a bit worried that every time I change something, I've created a new sort of factor, which I then have to work with. So I think, yes, this is another good point. I need to sort of check my full list of references which I've got and find those areas which have been altered in any way for the American audience, and see if that generates a significant uptick. I think it would for some, I'm sure. And I'm a bit worried, really, that in a way, this research that I'm doing now, if I'd done it 15 years ago, the people of the ages that I'm checking would all be more likely to have read Pratchett. Although the American audience is a little bit behind the British audience in reading time. But yes, these are two confounding factors for me, really. I mean, particularly these ones where there have been changes, on the one hand, for American audience, and then also this issue of age. It's going to be very difficult to say anything concrete if I want to use like statistical analysis until I have 1,000 sort of responses, really, in order to be able to carry out the correct statistical checks. Yeah.
Yes. Well, good luck. Then we have a good question here about phrasing. So when you send out these questionnaires, in order to find out whether people understand, how do you ask them?
Okay, can I remember the exact phrasing offhand? I used the same series of questions for each item that they were asked about. So what they did is they got a block of text about that. It's a good paragraph or paragraph and a half of text. Then it would be I would underline, or it was underlined, so that they could see without having to spot the cultural reference. There was actually a section in the questionnaire of free text of about 4 pages, and I asked them to identify as many cultural references as possible. I have not analysed this or used this in this research here. I'm looking at the ones where I actually underlined the reference and I said, do you recognise the reference here? What is this reference referring to in the real world? I also explained what I meant by a cultural reference at the very beginning of the questionnaire and gave them an example in order to let them understand what it was I was actually looking for. So I gave them an example of like, oh yes, this is a blah, blah, blah. It's this in the real world. I also asked them, why do you think Terry Pratchett made this reference here? So then they were supposed to say what they thought it meant in the story, whether it was supposed to just be an amusing reference, whether it was supposed to indicate something about the person in question or the item in question. So usually the responses would say something like, for the disintegrate in 5 seconds time, some people would say Mission Impossible series. Some people said spy films like James Bond and so on. And I added that as understanding because I felt that to all intents and purposes, that's close enough. Then some people said, I've seen it in films. But then I thought, well, the point here is now we've moved away from Mission Impossible, away from spy films and away just to films. It's a bit like saying I've read it in a book. And so I felt at that point I didn't always okay that as a positive identification of the referent, because we were too distant from the referent for that really to count. But of course, it's a grey area. It's a grey area. I mean, people may know the phrase but not know the origin. But I did ask people to explain, and that was how I got an indication from them of whether they really did understand or whether they were just going, sure, I get it, sure, I get it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to make. Then finally, can you once again shortly explain why people in Finland wouldn't get Jelly Baby, but they would get Sweet Fanny Adams?
Well, they didn't get Jelly Baby simply because Jelly Babies aren't really sold over here. I mean, it's not a product name. So, and also for a Finn, looking at that word, it would be Jelly Baby or something like this. So when you said it in your head, if you're thinking in Finnish, you wouldn't necessarily hear Jelly Baby. And of course, for an English speaker, when you say Jelly Baby a little bit in your head, you make that final click Of course, there's some people make it a little later than others, but you get it. Whereas for a Finn, even if they heard the sound jelly baby, it means nothing. But the reason that the Fanny Adams thing was successful was because it was not a translation of the cultural item. What happened was the translator looked at this Fanny Adams issue and went, this is not going to work in Finnish if I translate it as Sweet Fanny Adams. It won't work if I just put Sweet Fanny Adams in English there. It won't work if I translate the words into Finnish. I don't feel that I want to make an allusion to a famous dead person or child in Finnish history, because I mean that's pretty depressing, and that's not the point of the original reference, so that really wouldn't be what you'd want to do with the translation either. So what the translator did is that this is a lost cause. I have to remove this reference and replace it with something else, and managed to create a humorous reference in Finnish. The phrase sounds fun in its Latin form, and yet it's clearly a phrase in Finnish, and it's a recognizable mixture of phrases in Finnish when you see it in proper Finnish. And it's amusing. So if you like, cultural reference out, mildly humorous phrase in. So which means it fits the Pratchett sort of framework, but it was the best way to deal with this problem in terms of doing what Pratchett would perhaps have done if he were writing in Finnish, knowing that you cannot translate Sweet Fanny Adams into something which would be acceptable or understandable. So yeah, Fanny Adams itself was not translated.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that again. I think we should wrap up here so that we can give everyone a few minutes to prepare for attending the next presentation. So thanks again, Damon. Very informative presentation, very decent research. I enjoyed a lot. I hope you did too.
Thank you.